step forward to addressing this crisis head-on and ensure our nation can get back on track once we have addressed the serious public health threat and the resulting economic crisis as well. It's an important step, but it's not the last action we'll need to take before this pandemic is over. I'm going to do everything possible to continue working with my colleagues in a bipartisan manner to ensure Michigan communities and families have the resources and the support that they desperately need. I will also continue working closely with Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, local leaders, public health experts, and national security officials. It will continue to take each and every one of us doing our part and working together to prevent the spread of this pandemic, protect public health, and continue to address this economic crisis. But together, Mr. President, I know that we will get through this, and we will come out stronger on the other side. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, let me be very honest and tell you that there is much in this bill, and we have not yet seen the printout yet, that I am concerned about. I am especially concerned that the administration will be able to expend $500 billion in virtually any way they want, any corporation they want, with virtually no strings attached. The American people, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, do not want more corporate welfare, and they do not want policies which will allow corporations, in some cases, to receive loans or grants and then do stock buybacks to enrich their stockholders, provide dividends, or maybe raise the compensation benefits of their already wealthy CEOs. What the American people want right now is for us to use our taxpayer dollar in every way that we can to protect the working families of this country, to protect the middle class, to protect the 50% of our people who are living paycheck to paycheck. And as we speak tonight, half of our people in this country, in the richest country in the history of the world, are living paycheck to paycheck. And they wake up in the morning and they're saying, you know what, I can barely make it on the paycheck that I got because I'm making 12, 13, 14 bucks an hour, and now that paycheck has stopped. How am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to put food on the table for my kids? How am I going to make sure that the lights remain on? How am I going to pay my student debt? How am I going to pay my credit card debt? Somebody in the family gets sick. How am I going to pay that? Now, this bill has been worked on extensively in the last few days. There are elements in it that, in my view, are positive. Don't go far enough by any means. But one of the things this bill does do is provide the largest expansion of unemployment benefits in history, expending about $250 billion of federal funds. And what it does, importantly, the bill understands that for all kinds of absurd reasons having to do with Republican attacks on workers for many years, fewer than 50% of American workers today are eligible for unemployment benefits. What this bill does is says, rightly so, that in the midst of this terrible economic crisis where some people, nobody knows, where some economists are estimating that by June, the end of next quarter, unemployment could be 20 or 30%, what this bill does say is that whether or not you are eligible for unemployment today, you're going to get unemployment compensation. And that means many of the gig workers, people who drive Uber cars, many of the waitresses and waiters who make starvation minimum wages, many so-called independent contractors, they will be eligible for the extended unemployment benefit. And that is exactly the right thing. And the other thing that this bill does, which is right, is it says, okay, we are in the midst of a horrific crisis, unprecedented in modern American history. So not only are you going to get your regular unemployment benefits, we're going to add another $600 a week to it. And now I find that some of my Republican colleagues are very distressed. They're very upset that somebody who's making 10, 12 bucks an hour might end up with a paycheck for 4 months more than they received last week. Oh my God, the universe is collapsing. Imagine that. Somebody who's making 12 bucks an hour, now like the rest of us, faces an unprecedented economic crisis with the 600 bucks on top of their regular unemployment check, might be making a few bucks more for 4 months. Oh my word, will the universe survive? How absurd and wrong is that? What kind of value system is that? Meanwhile, these very same folks had no problem a couple of years ago voting for $1 trillion in tax breaks for billionaires and large profitable corporations. Not a problem. But when it comes to low-income workers in the midst of a terrible crisis, maybe some of them earning or having more money than they previously made, oh my word, we got to strip that out. We got to tell those poor people that no matter what. And by the way, when the McConnell bill first came up, unbelievably, and I know many Republicans objected to this, they were saying that, well, we want to give whatever it was, $1,000 or $1,200, but poor people should get less. You see, because poor people are down here, they don't deserve, they don't eat, they don't pay rent, they don't go to the doctor, they're somehow inferior because they're poor, we're going to give them less. Well, that was addressed. Now everybody is going to get the $1,200. But some of my Republican friends still have not given up on the need to punish the poor and working people. You haven't raised the minimum wage in 10 years. Minimum wage should be at least 15 bucks an hour. You haven't done that. You've cut program after program after program, and now, horror of horrors, for 4 months, workers might be earning a few bucks more than they otherwise went. Well, needless to say, this is an amendment that is coming up. I don't think it's going to go very far. And if it does go far, I will introduce an amendment to deal with the corporate welfare, the $500 billion in corporate welfare, which is, to me, a very serious problem. But I do not think they're going to get the 60 votes, and that will be the end of it. Mr. President, this bill also includes some $250 billion in one-time checks of $1,200 for adults and $500 for kids. Now, I have a couple of concerns there. Number one, I have believed that in the midst of this unprecedented crisis, that we should make this a monthly benefit, not a one-time benefit. And depending on what happens, and I expect very much that this Congress will be reconvening, because I think this coronavirus 3, the bill we're on right now, is going to be superseded by a coronavirus 4, because my strong guess is this does not go far enough. But the bill does include a $1,200 check for adults, $500 for kids. That will help in the short term. We've got to do a lot better than that. As many of you know, in countries around the world, UK, Denmark, other countries, the approach that they are taking, which makes sense to me, is to basically say to employers, if you keep your workers on the job, even if they're not working right now, we will pay, in the UK case, 80% of their salary. Other countries a bit higher. I think that is the direction we should have gone. This is a little bit more convoluted. But what we do here is give $367 billion in loans to small businesses, and those loans could be forgiven if those small businesses don't lay off workers. And I think for a variety of reasons that is exactly the right thing to do. The goal right now is to stabilize the economy by telling workers that they will have their jobs when they come back, when this thing is over, and that in the meantime, they will have all or most of their income. That is my preferred approach. This bill provides $150 billion to states and cities. And I can tell you that in Vermont, and I'm sure in every other state in this country, states and cities are hurting because we all know there has been a major decline in tax revenue. And that is an important thing to do because, by the way, in the midst of this crisis, a lot of the responsibility is going to fall on local and state government. And one of the concerns of many that I have about this bill is that in the best of times, this bill requires an enormous amount of work by the federal, state, and local governments. How do you get all these unemployment checks out? How do you deal with all of these small businesses who may apply for these loans? This is hard stuff, and it becomes even more difficult when so many workers who work for local and state government are not coming into work because of the coronavirus. And one of the issues that we are going to have to focus on big time is the implementation. If anyone thinks just passing this bill tomorrow everything is going to flow smoothly, you are terribly mistaken. This is a complicated, multifaceted bill, and it is going to take an enormous amount of work to make sure that the money goes where it should go in a cost-effective way. This bill does a lot of other things as well that I think will help the American economy. So to conclude, Mr. President, this is not the bill that I would have written. Frankly, I don't think it's the bill that most Americans would have written. I think most Americans are very, very apprehensive that 1/4 of this bill is going to go to large corporations with very little accountability. And in a political season, let me make the radical suggestion that we have a president of the United States who may end up targeting some of this money to states that he needs to win. So this bill has some good things and has some issues of real concern, but one thing we must not do is to punish low-income workers who might get a few bucks more than they previously earned. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Mr. President,
Senator from Nebraska.
I've just listened to the senator from Vermont's speech, and there's obviously a lot we don't agree on in life and policy, politics, and economics. He caricatured the entire purpose of this amendment tonight. The purpose of this amendment tonight is to affirm work. Under his vision, I don't know exactly where he thinks the workers who stock shelves and drive trucks right now would come from, because he made an argument about government subsidies that would be on a permanent basis higher than the wages of all those jobs. So I don't understand how his economic system would ever actually work, but I'd actually like to just praise him here. Two things. One, he said something that the politicians usually don't say. Usually when people are going to vote for something, they say the bill's salvific and utopian and going to do everything right. And if they're going to vote against something, they say it's the worst thing that's ever been written. And Senator Sanders just said that this bill has a lot in it. It's big, it's clunky, we're in the middle of a national emergency, and there's some good and there's some bad in it, and he's going to vote for it. I also believe this bill is big and clunky and stinky. There's a lot that's broken in it. There's some that's good and urgent and necessary and important, and there's a lot that's bad and poorly thought out and not going to be implemented very effectively. And on that, I'm also inclined to vote for it. So I appreciate his candor in admitting that this is kind of a big crap sandwich. But in addition, I want to praise the senator from Vermont for his candor in saying something that I totally oppose, but I appreciate his integrity and honesty in admitting it. He said, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, sir, please. He said he wishes the $1,200 monthly payment would be made, or the $1,200 emergency payment would be made monthly and permanent. Is that right?
No, not permanent, but during the crisis, yes.
Okay, that's helpful clarification. You were saying a lot of different things, and I thought you were arguing for a UBI of 14 grand. So I just wanted to clarify that point, but I appreciate the fact that you believe a lot of things very differently. The senator believes, speaking in the third person, a lot of things very differently than I do, but he argues forcefully for his positions. And I think that this body would benefit from more people who spoke as bluntly and directly as the senator from Vermont. I hope his positions are voted down again and again and again and again, but I appreciate the way he argues for his positions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
President, several senators on the other side have been arguing against the provision in this bill to supercharge unemployment insurance right now, something that Senate Democrats have negotiated with the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin, and Chairman Grassley. Based on what I'm hearing from senators on the other side, you'd think that this provision was pretty much going to end Western civilization. Now, supercharging unemployment benefits has long been a priority for Senate Democrats, and we've been fighting for those improvements in unemployment since the process began. In our view, it's the key to getting help to where...
Senator from Oregon,
Yes.
would you please use your microphone?
Thank the President.
Certainly.
Supercharging unemployment benefits has long been something Senate Democrats have been fighting for. It's the key to getting help where it's needed most. And believe me, colleagues, when you see the unemployment claim numbers tomorrow, if the numbers are accurate, this chamber is going to see that the unemployment crisis is exploding in America. I don't believe anybody in our great country should fall into destitution as a result of this pandemic. So I obviously disagree with my colleagues who oppose our amendment so strongly to improve unemployment benefits. I just want to make a few key points in response to their argument. First, I want to start with an argument I heard that just about knocked the wind out of me when I heard it earlier. It's the idea that nurses are going to quit their jobs as a result of this legislation. Mr. President, nurses are not going to be quitting their jobs to get unemployment benefits, because that's not how nurses think when they get up in the morning. By now, everyone has seen the Herculean efforts of our nurses fighting the pandemic. Nurses in America are brave. They care. They're the true professionals. From Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine, they're on the front lines of this fight, putting themselves in harm's way to save the lives of our neighbors, whether it's in South Carolina, Oregon, or anywhere else. They don't cut and run. In contrary to the suggestion of my colleague from Nebraska, retired nurses have been coming out of retirement in droves to help treat patients who are suffering because of the coronavirus. Second, it's a head-scratcher to me that my colleague from Nebraska is raising this objection now. I'm the ranking Democrat in the Finance Committee. I learned about his objection when I watched his press conference, and then I called him about it. The proposal's been out there for days. Senators have known about it the whole time. It's not a drafting error. It's not a last-minute surprise. What the senator from Nebraska wants to, in effect, drop now was part of the bill. And Mr. President, you're a member of our committee, and I enjoy working with you. What the senator from Nebraska wants to drop now, in fact, was part of the bill that Republican leader McConnell introduced on Saturday. He introduced it on Saturday because Senate Democrats insisted on it being part of the package. And as Secretary Mnuchin said this afternoon on national television, we all heard it, Republicans agreed. I'll have a little more to say about Secretary Mnuchin's remarks in a minute. Third, I want to talk about why this is so needed. why my Democratic colleagues and I have worked so hard to help the millions hit by this economic wrecking ball get through these horrendous times. For most Americans, the old unemployment rules would cover only a third to half of their lost wages. That's it. Pretty hard to pay the rent, put food on the table with that. Even before this crisis, Mr. President, the Federal Reserve found that nearly half of Americans wouldn't have been able to come up with $400 cash to cover costs in an emergency. So let's face it, millions of Americans were walking on an economic tightrope, balancing their rent against their food and the food against the fuel, and that was before the pandemic. That's why we on our side feel so strongly, so appreciative of the work of Senator Peters, Senator Menendez, who helped in the negotiations, and of course, the leader. We all said we need an improved supercharged unemployment benefit to replace people's lost wages. Those are people who shouldn't face a choice between homelessness, hunger, or bankruptcy because a virus has shut down our economy and cost them their job. This isn't the fault of any workers in South Carolina or Oregon or anywhere else. And while the consumer economy is shuttered, the Congress has a responsibility to make sure that Americans can bounce back in a matter of weeks or months. Otherwise, millions are going to struggle slowly to recover from the economic crisis, and many might not make it if the Senate doesn't move to help them now. Now. The panic people feel over the virus is already too much, and the least we can do as lawmakers is to have their backs when it comes to surviving this economic crisis. Now, all my colleagues know we're on the third bill in the fight against the virus. Mitch McConnell's first version of this bill did virtually nothing for those who are losing their jobs. I read it carefully. Out of 247 pages in the Republican leader's first bill, 8 lines of text, not 8 pages, 8 lines, and those 8 lines only dealt with filing for unemployment online. Now, that bill had an awful lot of corporate goodies, lots of slush funds for big corporations, but just a few measly lines for people hurting, for workers hurting, workers losing their jobs. Senate Democrats fought for and won changes that make up this robust, expanded, supercharged program of unemployment insurance. It's based on a bill that our colleague Senator Peters and I introduced not long ago. First, in these punishing economic times, Americans are going to need more weeks of coverage than they would otherwise get from unemployment insurance. The existing length of unemployment benefits will not cover the time this crisis will last. Second, the Senate needed to modernize the unemployment insurance program because it really hasn't changed much since it was developed in Wisconsin in 1932. Mr. President, in 1932, nobody was talking about gig workers. And that unemployment program that was invented then hadn't changed all that much. Certainly hasn't been built to take on the kind of challenge our country faces right now. Democratic senators and I looked at that system and said this old system wouldn't be good enough for independent contractors, the self-employed, gig workers, part-time workers, and freelancers. They're a big part of the face of the modern economy. They weren't the kind of workers anybody was thinking about in 1932 when the program was invented. Senate Democrats led the effort to get those people coverage, and I'm glad that at one point in the negotiations, we could get bipartisan support for it. For people who still have their jobs but have their hours slashed, we're going to bat for them. For people in the service economy, restaurants, salons, gyms, you name it. All those people who are suffering because their jobs and their businesses have been put on pause, we're going to bat for them. We're talking about millions and millions of Americans, people who are looking at hard times ahead, and they need our help now. The old unemployment insurance system wasn't working, so Senate Democrats said, we're going to come together and we're going to go to bat for all those independent contractors and the self-employed and the freelancers and the gig workers. And now I think not only are we going to help them over the next 4 months, but I think we have developed some ideas that can be part of reforming the unemployment compensation system after those 4 months. Now, I want to turn to why this agreement raises benefits specifically by $600 per month. I've heard my colleagues and their strenuous objections to that amount. The reason it is $600, Mr. President, is because Labor Secretary Scalia, after meeting with the Senate negotiators, myself, Senator Grassley, Secretary Mnuchin, Senator Menendez, Senator Portman, big group of us. Secretary Scalia, after meeting with Senate negotiators, left us with no other way to get benefits to workers quickly. Secretary Scalia said that the states had no other way to get the benefits to workers in time. We needed a simple solution. And I know my colleague, the distinguished President of the Senate, and others who are sponsoring this proposal to unravel what Senate Democrats did with Secretary Mnuchin, the Trump administration, and Chairman Grassley may not believe me, but I want to share the words of Secretary Mnuchin himself, and specifically on this question of why we were focused on making sure that workers could get that extra $600 a week. Just today, Secretary Mnuchin said, and I'm going to quote here, most of these state systems have technology that's 30 years old or older. If we had the ability to customize this with much more specifics, we would have. This was the only way we could ensure states could get the money out quickly and in a fair way, so we used $600 across the board. I don't think it will create incentives. Most Americans want what they want. They want to keep their jobs. That is what Secretary Mnuchin said today in defending the language that is in the bill as, in effect, the fastest, simplest way for workers to get their benefits, and why we disagree so strongly with the amendment from the senator from Nebraska to unravel that approach. The math shows that a standard payment of $600 is the simplest way to get to full wage replacement without causing, as of now, an administrative train wreck. So I'm going to close on this. I'm sure that everybody here read that unemployment claims are expected to go up by $2.5 million in 1 week when the statistics are released tomorrow. Let me say that again, 2.5 million. That's almost as many jobs that were lost in the entire year of 2008 when the Great Recession hit our country so hard. It's the single largest rise in unemployment since that figure began to be tracked. 12 entire months worth of Great Recession job losses, that's how many unemployment claims economists expect to see in a single week. This country has never faced anything like it. It's not a normal recession. This isn't a normal bill to try to stimulate the economy in which the government tries to give the economy a shot of fiscal adrenaline. This is a time when we face a shutdown of entire sectors of our economy. What the Congress needs to do is keep our economy alive and act now. We're not going to do that by shortchanging workers who are losing jobs, losing hours, or losing gigs. I feel so strongly. Americans want to work. Businesses want to keep their employees on the job. Americans want the economy to spring back to life once the pandemic is under control. And that's what supercharging unemployment benefits is all about. So here's the bottom line on the provision that Senate Democrats agreed with the Trump administration, Secretary Mnuchin, and Chairman Grassley on. Our proposal was not a drafting error. It didn't pop out at the last minute. It's not going to bring about the end of Western civilization. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will review what Secretary Mnuchin had to say this afternoon on national television, supporting what Senate Democrats negotiated with him and the administration, and join us in making sure millions and millions of Americans don't fall into destitution. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't wish to delay things, but I just want to make a couple comments. I did speak earlier this afternoon about this. It's almost an understatement to say that America's at an inflection point. We're facing a public health crisis unlike any we've seen in generations. Governments at every level, state, local, county, are racing to respond, react, and mitigate the crisis. Hospital systems are soon going to be overrun if they have not already been. The package here is a good one. Does it do everything? No. Is it perfect? No. But is it a lot better where we were? Yes. I think of the Senate as a body that should be the conscience of the nation. And it's time for us to have reality trump rhetoric. We've had enough rhetoric. Let's have something that passes that speaks to reality. I think of our own governor, Republican governor, who has worked so hard to help our state. This will give him some tools, as it will to our Speaker of the House and our President pro tem of our legislature. But with this bill, we support the victims of this terrible virus, the healthcare providers and first responders on the front lines tending to their care, the essential workers that are keeping our stores shelves stocked and necessities available, the families hit by the fallout from this pandemic. I have been fortunate. Been married now for almost 58 years to the best medical surgical nurse I've ever known. I hear her tell what it is. Marcel tells me what the doctors and nurses face in a situation like this. Mr. President, I pray that neither you nor I nor any other member of this body would have to face what they face on the front lines. We should go forward and pass this bill. I'd ask that my full statement be included in the record.
Without objection,
I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection,
Mr. President, I see that the senator from Maryland is on the floor, and I think he arrived a minute or two before me, so if he'd like to go first, I would want to give him that opportunity.
I'm grateful, thank you, Senator from Maine, but I'm happy to have you go first.
Thank you. Mr. President, all across the country, Americans are stepping up in response to the coronavirus pandemic sweeping our nation. Doctors and nurses are working endless hours and putting themselves at risk to care for the surge in patients. Manufacturers, including many companies in my state, are working overtime and retooling their product lines to produce medical testing swabs, ventilators, and personal protective equipment, all of which are vitally needed. Truckers are going above and beyond, missing time with their families so that they can deliver goods needed to restock depleted grocery shelves. People are looking out for their neighbors in a safe way. They're checking on them. They're making personal sacrifices to help prevent the virus from spreading to the most vulnerable members of our society. Help is on the horizon for small businesses and their employees who are facing economic devastation through no fault of their own. Mr. President, I have talked to small business owners all across our state, including small mom-and-pop operations like a third-generation diner operated and owned by the Simonis family in Lewiston, Maine. For the first time ever in 3 generations, they have had to close their doors. They've had no choice. As Linda Simonis told me in tears earlier this week, we've never been unemployed. Our son is unemployed. Our friends who have worked with us at this diner for years are unemployed. Mr. President, the agreement finally reached today includes a $377 billion small business economic relief plan that Senator Rubio, Senator Cardin, Senator Shaheen, and I authored as members of the Small Business Task Force. It is intended to help workers and small businesses just like the one owned by the Simonis family in Lewiston. And our group worked day and night to get this bipartisan package included in the broader legislation. And I want to do a shout out to our staff, because I don't think they've been to bed before 4 a.m. in the morning in any day in the last week. That's how hard they've worked too. Under our bipartisan approach, small businesses would be eligible for a 100% federally guaranteed emergency loan to cover 8 weeks of payroll, as well as certain expenses like rent or mortgage payments and utilities. If these businesses keep their employees on the payroll, in other words, if they keep issuing those paychecks, their loans would be completely forgiven. Here's how it would work. Small employers with 500 employees or fewer would be eligible to apply for these federally guaranteed loans. The loans would be available immediately through existing Small Business Administration certified lenders, including certain banks, credit unions, and other financial institutions. And a streamlined process would be created to bring other additional lenders into the program. The size of the loans would be tied to a formula based on the small business's average monthly payroll, and that would go back to February 15th, since that's when the coronavirus really started to come to our country and have an impact. The maximum loan amount would be $10 million. So as long as these small businesses retain their employees and issue those paychecks, which, keep in mind, also means in many cases that those employees will get their health insurance as well. The portion of the loan used to cover payroll and mortgage, interest, rent, and utility payments would also be forgiven. Furthermore, and this is important to states like those of the presiding officer and mine, which have large numbers of tourists coming each year, Employers with tipped employees would receive forgiveness for the additional wages paid to such employees. In addition, I want to point out that workers who have already lost their jobs due to this crisis can be rehired and paid under our program, and that should be our goal. Mr. President, this vital assistance cannot come a moment too soon. There are so many small businesses that have already shut down or are on the verge of doing so. They are trying to hang on just a little longer to avoid laying off their employees who are like members of their own family. In fact, in many cases, they are members of their own family. Without this package, we face an unemployment tsunami that could reach as high as 20%, according to the Secretary of the Treasury. Not only would this cause tremendous harm to millions of families, but it would also take a massive toll on the federal budget, far exceeding the $377 billion that we're using for this small business assistance program to keep workers paid and employed. What we want is to make sure those small businesses survive, that they're here when we've transcended this crisis, and that their employees are still able to come back to work for them. We don't want to break that link, that connection. We don't want those small businesses to give up and shutter their doors forever, decimating our downtowns and causing permanent job loss for the workers that are so much a part of their business. Now, larger businesses that are facing cash flow issues would be eligible for certain loans so that they can avoid laying off their workers. However, unlike the small business assistance programs, which would have their loans forgiven as long as they keep their workers employed, the larger businesses would be required to repay these loans in full. And I want to make clear that these large businesses would be barred from stock buybacks and increasing executive pay for the duration of the loan. And I fully support those restrictions. Of course, many of those small businesses don't have shareholders, so the idea of a stock buyback doesn't exist. Now, some of them, Subchapter S may, but many of them do not. I'm also pleased to say that we would cover the sole proprietor, the independent contractor, those many individuals who we rely upon to make our economy work. Mr. President, following my advocacy along with members from other coastal states, I'm also pleased that the bill includes $300 million to assist workers and businesses in our nation's fisheries, which support thousands of jobs in the great state of Maine. With this legislation, harvesters, fishing communities, aquaculture operations, and other fishery-related businesses will be eligible for this $300 million in assistance, which may include some direct relief payments. This helps protect our food supply chains, and this targeted relief will help ensure that the families and the coastal communities that depend on our fisheries can emerge from this crisis. Similar assistance is provided to our farmers as well. Mr. President, this bill also provides more than $30 billion for states, school districts, colleges, and universities to help them meet the unexpected expenses that have flowed from the coronavirus crisis. Our schools, our K-12 schools, will have access to $13.5 billion. which will help them support remote learning and meeting the needs of their students. And I want to take a moment to recognize the dedication of those teachers, administrators, school food service workers, and bus drivers who are not only making sure that students have access to remote learning, but are making sure that students have access to meals off-site. This bill provides funding to help them provide those meals in creative, but unfortunately more costly ways, such as delivering prepackaged meals along bus routes or directly to students in their homes so that they won't be hungry. We all know how important the school breakfast and school lunch programs are to our low-income families. When colleges and universities made the very tough decision to send students home for the semester, I spoke with several presidents in Maine, and they told me about the steps they were taking to make sure that their students could still receive a quality education, albeit online or remotely. They were also taking steps, as well they should, to reimburse students and their families for room and board, and they've shortened travel study programs. They're investing in the software and hardware infrastructures to bring classes online quickly. They're doing even more than that, Mr. President. The University of Maine, for example, has partnered with the state to prepare its dorms and its facilities for emergency uses if necessary. So the direct aid to colleges and universities is needed to help these institutions offset these sudden revenue losses and unexpected costs. There's also temporary flexibility applied to student aid, to student loans that also will be very helpful. This agreement, Mr. President, is not only a lifeline for workers, small businesses, and schools. It builds on the previous two packages that Congress has passed to promote the health and safety of Americans. It makes substantial investment in our nation's health system, biomedical research, and education, including a $130 billion infusion for our hospitals and healthcare providers that are struggling to cope with this influx of patients, and it provides $20 billion for additional resources for veterans' health care. It authorizes an $11 billion catalyst toward the development of an effective vaccine and therapeutics, effective treatments for those struck by this virus. It provides $1 billion for community services block grants to support critical social service programs for millions of low-income individuals. It gives the Centers for Disease Control additional funding to enhance its vital work. It assists communities responding to greater services with an increase of $5 billion for community development block grants. That comes from the subcommittee that I chair. It helps with transit systems. There's widespread help for those who are homeless, who are among some of the most vulnerable in our population. It strengthens the low-income home heating assistance program. That's something that Senator Jack Reed and I have long worked together on. We don't want families and seniors making impossible choices between heating their homes and buying food or medicine. This package also contains two additional pieces of legislation that I've introduced and championed. First, it contains provisions from the Mitigating Emergency Drug Shortages, or MEDS Act, legislation I authored that will help prevent a shortage of vital medications. I was shocked, Mr. President, to learn that 72% of the facilities that make vital, active pharmaceutical ingredients for our market here in America are located overseas. 13% of these facilities in China. We just can't have that, and we need far greater visibility into that supply system. It also contains a bill that I have long advocated for, the Home Health Care Planning Improvement Act. It will allow nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and others to certify patients as needing home health services. Now it's just a physician that can do it, even though a physician might not be the primary care provider, particularly in rural areas. So that will remove needless delays in getting Medicare patients the home health care that they need. That's a critical improvement at a time when our healthcare system's being put to the test and when people are being told they need to stay in their own homes to avoid spreading the virus. The list of benefits that will be felt in communities across the country goes on and on. Mr. President, it's imperative that we pass this bill tonight. Every day, more small businesses are forced to close their doors. Every day, Americans are losing their jobs and their income. Every day, medical professionals are increasingly overwhelmed by the exponential rise in cases. The package we are voting on to advance tonight will bolster our healthcare system, infuse funds into biomedical research that will ultimately produce a vaccine and effective treatments, shore up our economy and our businesses, support those who are unemployed, strengthen the link between employers and their employees, save millions of jobs of those employed by small businesses, and help prevent a devastating recession, perhaps even a depression in this country. Let us not squander this momentum when we're so close to getting this done for the American people. I urge my colleagues to join me in passing this critical legislation. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
The senator from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. As other senators have mentioned, we see our fellow Americans uniting around the country to fight the coronavirus, to help those in need. Most of all, we're grateful to the men and women in healthcare, the healthcare workers on the front lines of this fight, the nurses, the doctors, all the other staff in hospitals, in community health centers, in clinics, who are putting themselves and their own health at risk to help their fellow Americans. And we in this Senate, like our fellow Americans, must come together to do the right thing for the country at this moment in time, to provide a surge of help to those on the front lines of the coronavirus fight, and to help those who are suffering from the economic fallout. Workers and small businesses and mid-sized businesses and others who are absolutely getting clobbered as we all try to fight this virus together. And so Congress must unite this evening, as we have on two prior occasions during this emergency, when we came together to pass phase one, to provide emergency, immediate health care support to public health entities, to provide more funds to do research on a vaccine for the coronavirus, more funds for research on antivirals to address the coronavirus. And then we passed round two, the Families First Act, where we made sure that that testing was free, because we don't want any American to say, I'm not going to get tested even though I feel like I might have the symptoms. I'm not going to get tested because I can't afford it, putting both themselves and others in the community at risk. So we said we've got to make sure these tests are free. And we also provided sick leave because we don't want anybody going to work when they feel sick and may have the virus, if going to work is the only way they can put food on the table by getting a paycheck. So we said, look, stay at home and we'll provide for paid leave. Now, there was a gap, a big gap in that still needs to be addressed. But we took some important measures in phase one and phase two, and now here we are this evening on phase three, where we're not only providing additional dollars to fight the coronavirus and the health emergency, but also dealing with the economic fallout, which is growing by the day. And I'm not going to go through all the provisions that do that, and I will say that this bill is far from perfect. This is not a bill that I would have written. I dare say it's probably not the bill that any one senator would have written. But with all its flaws, it does some very important things and things that are absolutely necessary during this national emergency. There's been a lot of talk tonight about the uninsurance compensation provision. Those are absolutely essential as a lifeline to workers who each day are losing their jobs around the country in many industries. And it is absolutely essential that in that process, people who are out of work through no fault of their own are still able to pay their bills, their rent, or their mortgage, or to keep the lights on, or for food. And that's why we're working to make sure that they have real replacement income during this 4-month emergency period. And the provisions regarding small businesses and middle-sized businesses, those are very important too. I'm sure we're all hearing from folks who already had to close their doors, because when there are no customers coming in the door, there are no sales, no income, and so if you're a small business, you can't make your debt payments and you can't make payroll. So this bill does have a lot of very important provisions in it with respect to small businesses, and I'm really glad that we moved with respect from small businesses to loans only, to loans that would be forgiven so long as the small businesses spent those monies to, one, maintain payroll or rehire people if they've already had to let them go, and to pay essential bills. Because just adding more loans and debt onto small businesses would only be like an anchor around their necks at the end of a 4-month or whatever period it may be. They wouldn't be able to dig themselves out of that hole. So that was very important, to have loans that will be forgiven so long as the loans are used for the intended purposes. And we also made important provisions for nonprofits who hire millions of Americans, and as well for mid-sized businesses. With respect to some of the largest industries in the country that have been hard hit, it's appropriate to also give them help, but it's also important that as we do that, we safeguard the American taxpayer and the public interest. And when the proposal first arrived here in the Senate from the White House, we were looking at about a $500 billion slush fund with no strings attached. No real accountability, no real transparency. And so we've tried to tie that down so that we will have an inspector general with subpoena power, so that we will ensure that there will be no stock buybacks with these emergency funds. Now, we're going to still look at the fine print, but we've come a long way from the proposed blank check to the President and the Secretary of Treasury, which was in the bill as it arrived here as proposed by the administration. There's another thing that's in the bill that's before us tonight that was not in the bill proposed by the administration, and that is badly needed help for states and cities and towns who are on the front lines of this battle across the country. We heard about 5-6 days ago from the majority leader, oh, well, let's just wait. Maybe we can do that sometime down the road. Well, we've heard from a bipartisan group of governors through the National Governors Association that they need that help now. And I'm sure you've all been fielding calls from your elected officials, your governors and others, about how they desperately need additional help to fight this virus. And so I'm glad that this bill contains $150 billion to help those states. Now, Madam President, I want to raise tonight something that I discovered about this bill just a few hours ago that gives me real heartburn and actually, I believe, reflects badly on this United States Senate. Here's how we distributed the funds to the states. Each state, regardless of population, gets $1.2 billion. And then the remainder of the money, up to $150 billion, is distributed to states based on population. Now, you can question whether that's the best and most effective way to essentially allocate resources when you're fighting a coronavirus like this, which is more intense in some places than others. But that's not my overall point right now. Here's what we discovered. That the people of the District of Columbia, people of the nation's capital, were left out of that formula. They are fighting the coronavirus just like Americans in every other state and city. They are part of other federal formulas, for example, Title I for education, highway funds, and other federal formula dollars go to the people of the District of Columbia. They have a population that is higher than 2 of the 50 states. There are more residents of the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, than the state of Wyoming and the state of Vermont. But they were left out of that category that they're usually put in, and instead they were put into a formula with Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and some of the territories. And the net effect of that, the net effect of putting the people of the nation's capital in that formula versus the formula with the states, will cost the District of Columbia about $700 million. And that's because that other formula is based entirely on population, and Puerto Rico has about 3 million people in it. And so when you put the District of Columbia into that funding kettle, into that funding pot, they get shortchanged $700 million. And that's the case even though the people of the District of Columbia, send the federal treasury more tax dollars than the people of 22 other states. Let me say that again. The people of the District of Columbia send the IRS more tax revenues than the people of 22 other states. And yet, when it came time to write the formula for distributing emergency funds under the coronavirus, they weren't part of the kind of funding formulas they normally are. Now, I asked about this because I thought maybe this would be a simple fix. I mean, surely in a bill of $2 trillion in emergency relief, we can do right by the people of the District of Columbia and not shortchange them $700 million. And the answer I got back was no. No, this was not a mistake. This was not an oversight. That Republican negotiators insisted on shortchanging the people of the District of Columbia. And if I'm wrong about that, it would be a very easy fix in an amendment that could be offered by the majority leader, and I'm sure accepted unanimously. Accepted unanimously, except for the fact that this actually was a point that was negotiated. Now, Madam President, I'm not going to hold up a $2 trillion emergency rescue package that is urgently needed by the country for this, but I think it's shameful. I think it's shameful that in a $2 trillion emergency rescue package, we would shortchange the people right here in the nation's capital. People who we see coming into work every day. Many of the federal employees who work day in and day out for the federal government. Many of them live here, many of them live in surrounding states, many of them live all over the country. But for the people who live here, to shortchange them and to do it intentionally is really outrageous. And so here we are coming together, and that's the right thing to do. As I said, this bill has many, many flaws and many, many problems. I certainly wouldn't have written it this way, and I would never have done wrong by the people of the District of Columbia the way this was intentionally done, apparently, in this bill. But overall, we need this bill for the country. We need it because we have a national emergency, both on the healthcare front and the economic front. So I hope going away from here as we come together, and I hope we'll do the right thing with a large vote, I hope there'll be some senators, whoever were part of negotiating that deal, who said, no, we're going to shortchange the people of our nation's capital. I hope they will feel a little bit ashamed. And I think all those people who didn't want to change this provision, which is easy to change just like that, should feel ashamed. This is our nation's capital. The people who live and work here deserve to be treated with respect. There's no United States senator who represents the people of the District of Columbia. Some of us who live in the surrounding areas work hard to do so. I just wish senators from the rest of the country, and especially in this case, apparently our Republican colleagues, would show a little respect for the people who live in the capital of this great country. And I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that cloture motion with respect to the motion to proceed to H.R. 748 be withdrawn.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 748. Further, that the only amendments in order be amendments to be offered by Senator McConnell, 1578, and Senator Sass, 1577, or their designees. Further, that the Senate vote on the Sass amendment with a 60-vote affirmative threshold for adoption. Further, following disposition of the Sass amendment, the McConnell amendment as amended, if amended, be agreed to. The bill as amended be read a third time. And the Senate vote on the passage of the bill as amended with a 60 affirmative vote threshold for passage. Finally, if passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and that all roll call votes in this series be 30 minutes in length.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the bill.
Madam President.
Calendar number 157, H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 and so forth.
Madam President, I ask consent that I proceed under my leader time.
Without objection.
So here we are, colleagues, for the information of all of our senators. We will first vote on the adoption of the Sass amendment at a 60-vote threshold, and then our second and final vote will be on passage of the CARES Act, also at a 60-vote threshold. We're going to pass this bipartisan relief package, send it over to the House so they can put it on the President's desk. When the Senate adjourns this evening, our next scheduled vote will be the afternoon of Monday, April the 20th. Of course, during this unprecedented time for our country, the Senate is going to stay nimble. As always, we'll convene regular pro forma sessions, and if circumstances require the Senate to return for a vote sooner than April the 20th, we will provide at least 24 hours notice. Our nation obviously is going through a kind of crisis that is totally unprecedented in living memory. Let's stay connected and continue to collaborate on the best ways to keep helping our states and our country through this pandemic. And let's continue to pray for one another, for all of our families, and for our country.
Madam President.
The Minority Leader is recognized.
Now, Madam President, and I'll speak for a little bit briefly. The legislation now before us is historic because it is meant to match a historic crisis. Our health care system is not prepared to care for the sick. Our workers. We have order, Madam President. Our workers, our health care system is not prepared to care for the sick. Our workers are without work. Our businesses cannot do business. Our factories lie idle. The gears of the American economy have ground to a halt. Our country has faced immense challenges before, but rarely so many at the same time. Over the past few days, the Senate has stepped into the breach. We packed weeks or perhaps months of legislative process into 5 days. Representatives from both sides of the aisle and both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue have forged a bipartisan agreement in highly partisan times with very little time to spare. It's been a long, hard road with a remarkable number of twists and turns, but for the sake of millions of Americans, it will be worth it. It will be worth it to save millions of small businesses and tens of millions of jobs. It will be worth it to see that Americans who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own will be able to pay their rent and mortgages and put food on the table because we passed the greatest expansion of insurance to the unemployed in decades. It will be worth it to send gloves and masks to our nurses and to our doctors. It will be worth it to send ventilators and beds to our hospitals and begin rebuilding the public health infrastructure in America, a Marshall Plan in this new century for our medical system. It'll be worth it to save industries from the brink of collapse in order to save the jobs of hundreds of thousands of Americans in those industries. It will be worth it to put workers first. It was a long, hard road. Neither side can be completely happy with the final product, but it will be worth it. And I'm damn proud of the work we did over the past few days, because we put in the work, because we tested the limits of exhaustion, because we didn't immediately accept a bill drafted by only one party. The legislation before us tonight is better. Better for our health care system and the 65,000 Americans now afflicted with COVID-19. Better for our workers, better for our small businesses, better for our Indian tribes, better for our economy, and better for the American people. And so I must thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, especially the chairs and ranking members and their staffs. The past few days have been filled with drama. The past few hours were no exception. I know a few of my Republican friends still harbor reservations about voting for this legislation. But when there's a crisis of this magnitude, the private sector cannot solve it. Individuals, even with bravery and valor, are not powerful enough to beat it back. Government is the only force large enough to staunch the bleeding and begin the healing. This is a time when the American people need their government. This is what we were elected for. The oath we swear to the Constitution means we must protect the general welfare of the people. So let us marshal this government into action. There are millions of Americans watching us right now at home on their televisions, separated from friends and family, fearful for their children and their livelihoods, unsure of when the time will come when all of our lives may return to normal. Let us tell them tonight that help is on the way, that they are not truly alone, that this country, that this Senate, that this government is here for them in a time of dire need. This is a strange and evil disease. There is much we still don't know about it, and it is keeping us apart. When we pass this bill, instead of hugging each other, we'll wave from a distance. None of us can know when this plague will pass. The only thing we know for sure is that we must summon the same spirit that saw previous of generations through America's darkest hours. Fellowship, sacrifice, fortitude, resilience. That is what it means to be an American. With that spirit, this nation faced down war and depression and fear itself. I have no doubt that once again, America will ultimately prevail. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
I call up the substitute amendment 1578 and ask that it be reported by number.
Without objection, the amendment will be reported by member.
Senator from Kentucky, Mr. McConnell, proposes an amendment number 1578.
The Senator from Nebraska is recognized.
I call up amendment number 1577 and ask that it be reported by number.
Without objection, the amendment will be reported by member.
The Senator from Nebraska, Mr. Sass, proposes an amendment numbered 1577 to amendment numbered 1578.
Questions on the Sass amendment?
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, thank you, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Braun, Kramer, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Loeffler, Manchin, McConnell, Perdue, Risch, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Durbin, Schatz, and Schumer. Ms. McSally, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mrs. Murray, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Casey? No. Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Young? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? No. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Risch? Aye. Ms. Smith? No. Ms. Cortez Masto? No. Ms. Hassan? No. Ms. Rosen? No. Ms. Baldwin? No. Mr. Cornyn? Aye. Mr. Tillis? Aye. Thank you. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Udall? No. Mr. King? No. Mr. Leahy? No. Ms. Harris? No. Mr. Gardner? No. Mr. Jones? No. Mrs. Feinstein? No. Ms. Warren? No. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Warner, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Ms. Sinema, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Grassley? Aye.
All right, folks. So before they continue, if you want to read the full coronavirus stimulus bill, it's on our website, goldenstatetimes.com. Again, the full stimulus bill is on our website on a PDF at goldenstatetimes.com. Goldenstatetimes.com if you want to go read the final coronavirus stimulus bill. Right now, they are voting on the SAS amendment that could be added to the main bill. So that is what they're voting on right now. The big vote coming soon.
Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 48, the nays are 48. The 60-vote threshold having not been achieved, the amendment is not agreed to. Under the previous order, amendment number 1578 is agreed to. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Counter number 157, H.R. 748, an act to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to repeal the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health coverage.
The question is on passage of H.R. 748 as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin.
The SAS of 1977 was not agreed to. McConnell Amendment 1578 is agreed to.
Thank you. John's going to have me at 11:30. No, we're good. Thank you, though.
I'm going to take those on the phone. I have the sanitizer, but
I do.
We talked about that. So I'm thinking media people, we might do that. You know, next time this happens, we gotta talk about the charge or something. We could probably make that work if we got 3 or 4.
it's money in this bill. They grant to buy us. So if we get called back, there's money there to I'm sure it's subcommittee.
Of course, the military is still out there. They can get it. You know, if we need to go there, they get it. That's good to know that. Thank you. So be safe.
Tell us about
Easy now. We're up to 60. Mr. Barraza, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal,
But they lost 2. Had a good one.
Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker,
We have performed.
Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher,
Take the dogs out. See you during the day.
Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Markley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Markowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Gardner, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Harris, Hassan, Hawley, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kane, Kennedy, King, Langford, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Perdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Rosen, Rounds, Rubio, Sanders, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Tillis, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, Young. No senator voted in the negative. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye.
Tony was.
Mrs. Leffler. Mrs. Leffler, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 96, the nays are 0. The 60 vote threshold having been achieved, the bill is passed. The senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of mourning business.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, we just finished here on the Senate floor some very, very important work for the people we represent and have the privilege to serve, what we're calling phase 3 of our very important response to this unprecedented pandemic that is hitting our country, the health of our country, the economic health of our nation. And so we acted. A number of us worked well over the past week around the clock to put this legislation together, and I think it was a strong showing of bipartisan support. I was on the floor a couple days ago saying that what we needed to do were 4 key things: put cash directly in the hands of hurting families in Alaska and throughout the country, deliver rapid relief to small businesses that are being crushed by this pandemic and having to lay off workers, stabilizing key sectors of the economy to avoid more layoffs that are now quickly coming over the horizon and starting to happen, and sending a surge of new resources to medical professionals who are on the front lines. And, Mr. President, we did that. We did that relatively quickly. It could have been faster, but those were our goals, and that's what we achieved here. But here's the fact. This was legislation very important. It wasn't perfect, and there's probably a lot of mistakes here. And we're going to need to correct them quickly. There's probably Americans who weren't covered in some way, shape, or form by this legislation who need help, and we're going to need to cover them quickly. There's likely new challenges in this pandemic that seems to be changing every day, new challenges with regard to this crisis that we're going to need to address. And the final thing, Mr. President, is when we look at what we just did here, this was focused on the immediate crisis. Business interruptions, the health crisis. But what we need to be looking at is when we get through this crisis, and we will, more resilient, more stronger than ever. As I mentioned in my remarks the other day, some Washington Post reporters a couple days ago questioned the mettle and resiliency of Americans. Maybe we're not as tough, strong as we used to be to get through these crises. They just need to go to Alaska and recognize how wrong they are in that, or see some of the Marines that I've had the privilege of serving with for the last 26 years. They would recognize quickly that they're wrong. Of course, we have the mettle and tenacity to do this. But we need to be working on phase 4. Phase 4 is going to be the policies that we implement here in the Congress to turbocharge this economy so when we're out of this crisis, we can come back fully, more strongly in a way that our economy was just 2 months ago. So there's a lot of work that I think we could be doing and we're likely going to have to be doing. A number of us are going to begin working on that phase 4 approach to this pandemic. The turbocharging of this economy once we get out of it. And I'm glad to start work on that with my colleagues here in the Senate. So as I said, Mr. President, there's a lot of work to do, but the Senate is getting ready for a recess for almost a month. That's what we're getting ready to do. The country is facing one of the biggest crises in our history, and the Senate is leaving town for a month. I think this is a mistake. I think it sends the wrong signal to the people we serve. I think our duty station should be here to be ready on a moment's notice to help the citizens that we have the privilege of serving. Because if there's one thing about this crisis that we've already seen is that new challenges pop up every day. Every minute, every hour. And yet we're going to go on recess for almost a month. Don't understand this. I don't agree with it. And I certainly hope, Mr. President, if and when our country needs us, if we see some big mistakes in this legislation, if we recognize whole groups of Americans don't get the relief they need and the Congress needs to act, that we're not going to just say, well, we're on recess for 30 days. Sorry, we'll get to you when we come back at the end of April. I think that would be a real mistake. Because as we're seeing in this crisis, there's a lot of answers that just can't wait till the end of April. There's a lot of challenges that we need to be addressing daily, and there are going to be more, and yet we won't be here to address them. So at a minimum, Mr. President, I hope that when our country needs us in the next month, and it's likely going to need us, that my colleagues will be ready on a moment's notice, wherever they are, to come back to this body and get to work to help the people we serve. And I think it's very likely that that's going to happen in the next week or 2 or 3. And I hope my colleagues stand ready to do that and not use the excuse that we'll see at the end of April to address your problems, America. That's not what we need to be doing in the midst of this very, very serious, unprecedented crisis where our citizens need our help. We had a good start tonight, a very good start, but there's going to be a lot more, and I hope this body's ready to act quickly. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The majority leader is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session and the en bloc consideration of the following nominations: Executive Calendar 570 and 631.
Without objection.
I ask consent the Senate vote on the nominations in bloc with no intervening action or debate, that if confirmed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table in bloc. The President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection. The question is on the nominations in bloc. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nominations are confirmed in bloc.
I ask unanimous consent that following leader remarks on April 20th, the Senate proceed to executive session and the consideration of executive calendar number 556. I further ask consent that at 5:30 p.m. the Senate vote on the nomination, and that if the nomination is confirmed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Without objection. So ordered.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to legislative session for a period of morning business. The Senate is permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 3504, which was received from the House.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 3504, an act to amend Title 38 United States Code, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the Moran substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to. The bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Committee on Veterans Affairs be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 4771 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report.
H.R. 4771, an act to amend Title 38 United States Code, and so forth, and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the committee is discharged. The Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S. 3587 introduced earlier today.
The clerk will report.
S. 3587, a bill to require the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to conduct a study on the accessibility of websites of the Department of Veterans Affairs to individuals with disabilities and for other purposes.
Is there objection to proceeding to the measure? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that notwithstanding the upcoming adjournment of the Senate, the President of the Senate, the President pro tem, and the majority and minority leaders be authorized to make appointments to commissions, committees, boards, conferences, or interparliamentary conferences authorized by law, by concurrent action of the two houses, or by order of the Senate.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the junior senator from West Virginia, the senior senator from Alaska, and the majority leader be authorized to sign duly enrolled bills or joint resolutions on Wednesday, March 25th through Monday, April 20th.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn to then convene for pro forma sessions only, with no business being conducted on the following dates and times, and that following each pro forma session, the Senate adjourn until the next pro forma session. Monday, March 30th, 11 a.m., Thursday, April 2nd, 10 a.m., Monday, April 6th, 10 a.m., Thursday, April 9th, 10 a.m., Monday, April 13th, 10 a.m., Thursday, April 16th, 3 p.m. I further ask that when the Senate adjourns on Thursday, April 16th, it next convene at 3 p.m. Monday, April 20th, and that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, The time for the two leaders be reserved for use later in the day and morning business be closed. Further, upon the closing of morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the vital nomination under the previous order.
Without objection.
So if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask the Senate adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate is adjourned until 11 a.m. on Monday.
All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us and choosing us as your stream of choice. The Senate is now adjourned. Now it's up to the House. The House says that they're going to do it. They're going to pass the coronavirus stimulus bill as a voice vote. So we're going to have to see what happens on Friday. So stay tuned, because tomorrow there's another White House press briefing for the coronavirus with President Trump, Vice President Pence, and the coronavirus task force. So make sure you guys join us tomorrow bright and early for more coverage of President Trump, the White House, Congress, politics in general here at Golden State Times. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Gold State Times. Again, that's at Gold State Times. Make sure you guys join us for that. Thank you so much once again to everyone that joined us tonight. And we hope that you guys have a very good night. And we'll see you guys here tomorrow morning for more coverage of, like I said, the White House, politics, breaking news, and everything else in between. Right now, we are updating and uploading on our website, goldenstatetimes.com. We're also keeping everyone up to date on Twitter at Gold State Times. So make sure you follow us at Gold, not Golden, State Times on Twitter. And you visit our website, goldenstatetimes.com. Again, that's goldenstatetimes.com. If you want to see the full PDF of the final bill that the Senate just voted on and approved 96-0. So if you want to go and read it for yourself, it's over 800 pages. So if you want to go read it for yourself, you can do so on our website, goldenstatetimes.com. goldenstatetimes.com. Thank you so much, folks, and we'll see you soon. Peace.